Thank you so much for joining us today for a continuation of our conversation on censorship that started during Banned Books Week in the first week of October, but is continuing throughout the rest of the year. And we're so thrilled to have with us Professor Greg Geffrard. He is the Associate Director at Gainesville Theatre Alliance and also the Director of Acting and Assistant Professor of Acting at Brenau University. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here.
Yes. And the focus of our conversation is going to be on the upcoming Gainesville Theatre Alliance production of The Crucible in February. But before we start talking about that, I think our audience would be very interested to hear a little bit about you and what brought you here to producing The Crucible.
Yes. So I am a first-generation Haitian man who was born and raised in Miami and in Boston. I was raised by women, so I'm like one of the few men in my family. So I've always been, so the dynamic and being an observance of the life of women has always been something that's been part of like my, that's always been in my purview, part of my existence. I originally was going to be an orthodontist. That's a whole story and a whole thing one day. But really enjoyed theater, and spoken word poetry is actually how I got into the performance space. And I've been doing theater since I was about 16, and fast forward 21 years later, here I am. For the last 11 years, I was living in Chicago. As an actor and as an educator, I was primarily working as a teaching artist, working with like primary, secondary, and high school students, and then started teaching at the collegiate level back in 2020, which is also around the time when I started doing my work as an intimacy professional, intimacy director, intimacy choreographer, meaning that I help to stage scenes of like simulated sex, moments of intimacy on stage for live performance, but also thinking about not only the staging or the choreographing of things, but also how does one create sustainable environments for artists to work, and be able to tell and navigate the discomfort of that is found within the stories, but making sure they're doing it in a sustainable way that works for them. So we're thinking about the people beyond the characters that they're playing on stage. And so I have been here in Georgia for the last 2 months, heading up this BFA program, and just reconstructed the entire catalog, thinking about what does a 4-year program at Brenau look like.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. And I'm thinking what you're describing your work as an intimacy coordinator, that probably means that you've had a lot of experience working with plays that deal with challenging, difficult, more adult subject matter that's often the target for censorship. So this is probably a realm that you are very familiar with, I would guess. Would you say that's correct?
That is very correct. One quick thing. So intimacy choreographer, intimacy
Oh,
director is live performance. Intimacy coordinator, somebody who works film and television.
I see.
So yeah. So just want to make that distinction. But two, you are absolutely right. Whereas I find that that which I gravitate towards is that which tends to be uncomfortable truths, but that is something that has always been part of my existence as somebody who is in a society that was not built with me in mind. I think often where institutions, whatever, be it artistic or otherwise, I don't say get it wrong, but the challenges come from they think the notion of all are welcomed here is enough, as opposed to thinking about we have built this with you in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're talking about censorship, if we're talking about excluding people, I find that seems to be the place where it's rooted. It's because it's not the fact that you're not inviting people in, but you're not proactively thinking about what these individuals need in order to thrive in those environments, as opposed to just simply surviving and living on the fringes of. And I think something that I think about specifically when it comes to censorship, and I think the reason it's so easy for it to get into hysteria, and like specifically mass hysteria, is because it is operating from a place of like half truths. it's like giving you information about something, but not the complete information about like the source of things. Like perfect example, if like, say you got yourself a haircut and I come up to you and I was just like, oh, I see you cut your hair. And
And
then
just
didn't say anything
stopped.
after that. So then it put you in a place that's just like, does he like it? Does he not like it? Why is he addressing it? Why is it even? So it literally
Yeah,
puts the onus on you, and I can then shirk accountability and just like, I just addressed your hair. So
right.
where I think the connection, and I apologize if I'm jumping ahead on another question you're about to ask, but I think the connection of something like specifically a world of 1692 Salem, Massachusetts, and the world that we're living in now is we're kind of inundated with information,
Mm,
but a lack of fact checking. Like
mm,
fact checking is not a thing. So anybody can put information out into the space without it being checked, without it talking about where it's resourced, without citing anything. And that which is an opinion kind of becomes a fact. And it is not actually coming from a place of trying to inform. And so it just evokes confusion, and so much can happen within that confusion.
hmm. That's so interesting. I've never really looked at the Crucible through that lens, but if you look at like 1692 Salem, people were operating from too little information, or with this idea that everybody from the judges on down through society assumed that witchcraft was real, and they were accepting spectral evidence in court of just visions of people's astral projections attacking people. And the idea that other more scientific causes could have been at work or mass hysteria was not considered. But then, in contrast to today's environment, we have so much information that it's almost impossible to tell the good from the bad, and you just run with the most sensational story. So I think that's a really interesting contrast of two different information environments that result in the same behaviors. But and that kind of
Yeah,
ties in. Oh, sorry, what were you
I was
saying?
going to say, and going a little further in that, and I think this is something that I think we very specifically see in like social media spaces. And it's not to say that this is good or bad. It's just an observation made from a space of curiosity, specifically thinking about, I find that we tend to fall into two very, very specific camps, which is either seeking spaces of affirmation or seeking spaces of information.
Mm,
So it is either we are seeking a space in which that which we believe that we know and understand is echoed back to us, versus being in spaces, or the opposite, being a space that we're getting information that challenges our preconceived notions, and we're seeing whether or not, I mean, it serves as a mirror to see whether or not that which we believe still stands in the face of this new information we've been given. And being that, I find the connecting thread between our world and the world of 1692 is individuals were seeking answers, because living in ambiguity, living in the unknown,
mm,
is the thing that causes unease. And so it was the willingness to accept an answer, even though it came at the harm or the risk of other people, because at least we can say, then we have the answers. We understand what this is. Because I think something that's also kind of not spoken about enough when we're thinking about the Crucible is just like, there were individuals living in a very specific part of what we now call America, but there was this massive unknown out west. Like everyone was living kind of like the Northeast and maybe a little bit in the South, but like there was so much that was undefined. And it's only like talked about just like ever so slightly, but like the indigenous people that were there, it's just like they either converted to Christianity, or they were kind of like pushed out of that space. But there was more unknown space, the woods, that like, you had more of an unknown, and can build like, in your imagination, like cultivates all this, like what else can be out there. And it's like, it's out there to get me, it's out there to do this. And then it's very easy in those spaces then to lean on somebody who can give you comfort, somebody who can go, I have the answers to this. Let's pray, child. Like I have the ability to protect you, to give you that, to give you solace, to give you hope, to give you a foundation of like knowing something. And so it's rather intoxicating. And I kind of, for me, that's my way into understanding why the girls did what it is that they did.
That's fascinating. So like the first step being then trying to truly get into the minds of what it was like to live at that time where you're surrounded by the vast unknown and there's so much uncertainty surrounding you. Uh, Thank you for that insight. And I was wondering, for those who may be watching this interview who might not be as familiar with the plot of The Crucible, would you mind just giving a very short overview of what the play is about?
A short overview, she says.
Yes.
So the play takes place between 1692 and I believe it's maybe 1701. It might have actually gone that long, or actually much shorter. I think it's actually more of a 3 to 5 year window. I apologize for not having those dates exact.
Oh,
But during this time period of an unknown, there was this fear. There was this fear that there were individuals, because there were very mysterious things that were occurring and folks were seeking an answer, and very specifically they really wanted it not to be connected to Satanism, demons, like all these like, and because the individuals like the preachers of those times were essentially put in a position to like kind of like not protect the town, but like to simply be there to bring the to be the foundation of that town, to be that solace. And so it was a matter of folks trying to seek answers. And then the kind of the underbelly of it all was it became very easy for you to call out your neighbor and accuse them of witchcraft and accuse them of being a witch. But what was actually also occurring during that time is if you were accused of being a witch, then you couldn't hold on to your land. And so what was actually the underbelly of all this is going on was like a land war. It was people who were essentially, because if you were condemned in the court as somebody who was connected to witchcraft, you couldn't keep your land and therefore pass it on to your. And so a lot of the people, a lot of the bad actors, from the adult standpoint, and during this time were essentially like seizing land from other people and accusing their neighbors of like being witches. And so it came to a point where specifically in the Crucible, where the girls, like these young girls who were not listened to really before, were the ones who were saying like they saw these things, and folks then started thinking of them as like this vessel, this pod, and this connection to God to like essentially save us all and tell us about all these witches that are among us. And at the heart of the story is Abigail and John Proctor. Abigail being a young lady who was, well, girl, I have to put that into context, a girl who was a servant for John Proctor and his wife. And it's clear that there was an inappropriate relationship that had formed between them. And Elizabeth, John Proctor's wife, asked them to kick Abigail out. And so in Abigail trying to get back with John Proctor, and having this new power, this new platform to be heard, starts accusing people of witchcraft, and Elizabeth Proctor is somebody that is called out. And so John Proctor, through this, being one of the main protagonists of the piece, is essentially fighting for his wife's life and the life of his like friends, because it starts becoming very clear the people who are being accused are connected in a very specific way to John Proctor. Yeah, I think that's all I can say without completely giving away the ending of it.
yes.
Even though it is based on historical facts, so you can go and look up, like, yeah, you can go look up John Proctor and many of the people in the piece that this was based off of.
A 300-year-old spoiler isn't really a spoiler at that point. Yeah.
Yes, and to bring it on to the macro, so Arthur Miller wrote this piece in response to McCarthyism in the 50s. So the Reds 50s, right? 1950s, I believe
Yes.
it was. Yes. And it was essentially a time of calling people out of being like communists, of like people, these individuals. So it's the parallel of the public being in a place of hysteria and trying to find answers and trying to find who is culpable for the bad things that are happening, and essentially calling out their neighbors, the people that they have proximity to, and the unfortunate harm and in some cases the deaths that occurred during that time.
So you see these themes of fear, hysteria, seeking answers in the most available location, and also opportunists sweeping in and taking advantage of the fear, just echoing from the 1600s through to the 1950s. This
Yeah.
is kind of a contentious question, so feel free to answer this how you will. But do you see echoes in the Crucible and these themes today as well?
Oh, I think that's a very clear question,
Yes.
actually. And the answer is yes, because so one of the driving themes of my vision for this particular iteration of the Crucible is really playing around with the idea of fear, but using the acronym of FEAR, of false evidence appearing real. And
Oh,
so it is a matter of, what are the things that people believe that they're seeing? What are the things that people believe that they hear? Because I joked in really early on about this piece, and I said, "Oh yeah, Crucible. It's just like it's a game of telephone that's just gone horribly wrong." Like that's essentially what it is.
I
It's
mean,
like,
in a nutshell, that's a good
it's like
summary.
I heard a thing, I think you heard a thing, and it's just like, but it goes back to that theme of like incomplete information.
Yeah.
It's just like, because one of the big things about this piece and how it starts off is just Paris like finds like he catches the girls in the woods, and because they don't want to say specifically what they were doing, they're just like, oh, like the spirits kind of made us do this thing because we were there with Chichiba, and so it's a matter of not getting that full information and the fear of like what potentially is happening. And so playing around with from a design standpoint, like playing around with lights, like what are the things that we can see, and like playing around with like shadows and such. But bringing it to the present context, we are constantly being told by leaders, those who are supposed to guide us, what we should be fearing. And a lot of times that, sorry, I'm gonna get political here, that which we're told to fear is that which is within our proximity. But the people who have the most influence on us are also the people in if I'm talking about the construct of this country, it's like the people who have the ability to have the most impact on us are the ones who have also the great amount of distance from us. It's really easy for policymakers to make policies because they don't necessarily have to deal, or they're insulated from the consequences of those policies they put into place.
Yeah.
And they have found ways for themselves to benefit and not see the suffering that comes from that benefit. And so I find that it gets to a point, because spoiler of the play, it gets to a point in the play where like there are towns that start to overthrow the courts because they're just like, you are literally trying people and killing people off without any evidence, because the litmus test of which is just like, we're going to hang you.
Right.
Sorry for that, I didn't give that content disclosure, but it's like, we're going to hang you, and if you're a witch you'll be able to get out of it, or we're going to burn you alive, and if you're a witch you'll be able to get out of it, but if we do this and you don't survive, oh, then we know that you weren't a witch. But it's just like, but that which is already said is already in the space, because there's it's very much like, we're dealing with the child like object permanence.
Mhm.
It's just like, it is worse to be accused of being a thing than to actually be the thing. Like this is very prominent in the conversations around like racism in our country, or homophobia, or any of those isms that is associated with somebody in a title. Because, and this will be the final thing I'll say about this right now, we live in a society in which we do not have restorative practices for people who have caused harm or have done wrong to a community. There are no restorative practices on what that looks like. And so to be even considered to be bad or not good is there's kind of a permanence that is connected to it, even though it is later found out that you are innocent, you haven't done anything. That idea is still connected to you in perpetuity. And so it is very easy to play on people's fear that you don't want to be seen as this, because even though we can later find out, and history will tell us that wasn't true, you are immediately and constantly connected with that.
Mhm.
Elizabeth has a other line. She's like, "You're a good man, John Proctor." And it's like, it's that. It's like, I need to remind you that you are good, because John Proctor does a lot of not so great things in this piece. One of them being like having a relationship with a child. Like, there's no
Right.
way around this. Like, I cannot sugarcoat that part. Um, but it's so interesting because he says, I have my name back at the end. He rips, like, he confesses and he signs his name, but he doesn't want to give them that because his name is all he has. His good name is all he has. And so that idea of like how I'm perceived is so important to people, and what are the titles that are connected to us, that unfortunately people play on that, those like political figures and people in positions of power that we like entrust and give power to, kind of utilize that to get what it is that they want from us, which is our support, but don't give that support in return always.
So it's almost reputation as a commodity. And
Mm-hmm.
so I guess in Salem, it would have been any association with witchcraft or Satanism. And in the 1950s, it's any association whatsoever with communism or the Communist Party would taint your name in perpetuity. That's
Absolutely. And I think in the present context, it's attention capital.
mm,
It's, like, we're constant, like, I mean, I think that's what the girls kind of like really start feeding into, is just like this attention capital, this ability, like, this in this moment, me as a young person who is constantly being told, young people should be seen and not heard, and then you add the intersecting of just like there's a bunch of girls. It is a thing of like, what happens when you are in a position where you're given all this power, but you're in a society that was never meant to give you that power. And what happens? And then unfortunately, like, another spoiler alert, like, the girls, like, I think people forget about this, but like Abigail and some of the girls like run away at the end.
right.
Like, they just disappear from, because they're just like, they're not ready to deal with the consequences of this power that they've been entrusted with, and having to deal and be accountable for the harm that they've caused.
Yes, that I think that's such a when you were describing the plot of the Crucible at the beginning, that was something that you said that really stuck with me was you always think of Abigail as being framed as a classic villain, but she was also a completely disenfranchised person who suddenly found herself with a voice and with power. And so it's hard not to sympathize with her in that way as somebody just gleefully turning the system on its head. Yes, I was wondering, you also mentioned very briefly the vision that you have for staging the play. Um, is there a lot that you could tell us about that, or is that something that you would prefer to keep for audiences to discover for themselves when they go to see it?
Oh no, we will share. We will
Oh,
share.
great.
Yes. So that's a little bit of like the opening sound of the piece. Something that I was really interested in is like, what does like the naked voice sound like? I mean, these are not individuals who are connected to technology in any kind of way and such. And this play really starts off with the the notion or the understanding is like, these are they're viewed as like, like they're practicing something witchcraft, because it's like, it's a bunch of girls in the woods dancing. And so it is just like, witchcraft is what is happening here. And something that I'm particularly playing with as a conceit is working around with shadows, because of that, like the false evidence appearing real. So playing around with, Salem witch trial and such. Um, but and playing around with that idea of fear. And I really actually really like this quote, like, the enemy is fear, we think it's hate, but it's fear because of what of how that is such a catalyst for getting people to believe. And where, I mean, we're talking about, you know, religion and everything like that. And it's like the fear that you're not doing the will of God is something that is specifically used and weaponized against people in this world. Thinking about as I talk about like the westward movement and like looking at this first this first map over here, it's like this is the only part of the US at the time that was explored, and all of this is an unknown out here. And so what does that do to a people, especially the indigenous people that were there? And just thinking about those connections and what those shadows look like. I want to start playing on people's perceptions from the beginning. And so something that I'm really fascinated with, so I'm doing two specific things from a design standpoint. One, playing around with shadow, like thinking like scrim and shadow work, more like if you want to look up like manual cinema, like they do like a lot of like shadow work. They tend to do like puppets and shadow play and such like that. But really playing with the idea of what does something look like, or what do we think that we're seeing? And playing around with the idea of the townspeople are always kind of active in the space. Like while a scene is happening, something is said, and then like somebody hears something and like runs off, because like how exactly do we keep on being in a place where we're just like, how is this information getting out, and how these half truths kind of making their way and infiltrating the town? And so really playing around with like this shadow play, this like we believe we're seeing a thing, but then revealing it to us. Like I know like the opening is like, I want to have like the girls dancing in the woods and it looking like they're levitating, like all these things are happening. And then the light is revealed. And then you realize it's like, it's just a bunch of girls playing in the woods.
Oh, that's amazing.
But our fear makes us think that like this is something scarier than it is, because we don't fully understand what it is that we're seeing.
Yeah.
And so there's a very specific type of movement style called the frantic assembly, or the frantic method, which is it is a devising style that is in connection with like bodies and movement and arcs, and how exactly do we work from a place of one of the principles that they talk about is like connect, affect, disconnect, just so we can get back to that place of connection. So like, what does it look to have like touch in a world where touch is not something that is encouraged? We have those Puritans, that idea of this like touch is something that is reserved between like partners, between husband, wife, and such. And so a world devoid of touch, what does it look like to see people in contact and essentially craving that contact and that connection? Where we can see some parallels in our own world is just like, we just went through a pandemic. We're still in a pandemic, but we were definitely sheltered in place. And like, what was, thinking about what was that first moment that you like saw somebody and were able to hug somebody that you haven't seen in months. Like that is the constant, but that is, and now imagine that being your constant state of being. You're constantly in this connection. You're in community with, but not in connection, physical connection with people. And so really playing around with this idea of like this shadow play is something that I'm super excited about. So like the voice and what that sounds like to be, what happens when you hear this kind of in the space, like what that does to us, because we know that's connected to a person and not some kind of machine. But yes, so I really want to play, because one thing I really love specifically about the theater is two people who have known each other forever and have like a lot of similarities in the way that they see things can walk into a theater space and watch something and walk away with two vastly different experiences. And so just really wanting to like, for folks to be like, oh, did you catch that over there? And it's like, oh no, I was too busy watching that. Like, I want that, because like, I think that is the closest that I can get people to that understanding of hysteria without actually wanting to put people into hysterics. I don't think, like, if people are running out of the theater, like, I don't think that's a job well done. I think that I might have missed the point just a little bit, because ultimately something that I'm thinking about, because it's really hard to find kind of like, I mean, pun intended, like it's really hard to find the light in this piece. And so what is I think everybody is on an arc to find, it's on their journey. Every single character in there is essentially trying to find their way to the light, to be able to see what the truth is. And I'm very fascinated with like, what does that look like for everybody? You know, I mean, for Abigail, like finding that light, that the town was never going to be able to provide her the light that she wanted because she thought John Proctor was that light. But he's like, you don't have access to my light. And so she went and found that somewhere else. You know, John Proctor having a moment at the end of like, but I have my name, and ripping that up and essentially not condemning his friends to this death. That is how he finds his light, even though it costs him his life. You know, Elizabeth is able to see her husband finally like be who she believes him to be. You know, he still has his good name. And so I think it is ultimately that. There's an image that I just like really, really love that I'm gonna share screen just one more time. It's an image that just like really like kind of speaks to me in a very specific way. This top image here. Like the light, like bathing in like that light, and being that one of the, I really wanted to have a dark aesthetic of like shadows and such. It's like the lovely thing about doing something of that nature, of like keeping us constantly in a place, is like when that dynamic opposition, when we're just like, when light kind of like floods the space, like what is that going to do to us? Not realizing that we've kind of been in this like dark place for like the last, because I mean, I'm really hoping I can make it 2 hours. It's a long play, y'all. It's a long play. It ain't 3 hours, but it's a solid two. Like, you got to give me a solid two. It's just a lot of information. But yeah, but what does it look like for everybody in the piece to be on a journey to find their light? You know, one of the characters, can't think of his name right now, but like, you know, he was accused, and they tortured him by like putting, you know, weight on his chest and trying to get him to confess. And, you know, his final words are more weight. Like, I think that's one of the famous ones that we know about, but it's because he never confessed. Now he can pass his land down to his sons, because if he confessed, then he would have to relinquish literally his land and literally the protection of his kids. You know, like, and so it may have gotten them to a dark place, but like he found his light, his ability for his kids to have a way forward. So,
wow.
Yeah.
So as a non-theater person, it's just so interesting to hear how set design can not only help get you in the mindset of the times, but also be a tool for character development too, or to illustrate character development. So that's a really fascinating glimpse into what the production is going to look like. Thank you for sharing that. And
yeah, I also can't have a bunch of college students just living in a dark place for 2 months. That just doesn't sound like a fun, doesn't sound like, come on and work on my play. Like,
scrabble around in the dark. My mind kept, while you were talking, kept on going back to the analogy that you used at the beginning of, oh, you cut your hair. I don't think that I quite grasped it at first, but it makes so much sense of you're giving the audience these blanks and allowing them to project their own fears onto it and have the experience of the people in the middle of a mass hysteria. And that's so cool. That's going to be really neat.
Yeah, it's constantly just like worst case. It's just like, because our brains are constantly thinking worst case scenario.
Right.
Like, because our bodies are built for survival. So our body's just like, oh, is this a perceived threat? Do we need to figure out how to, as opposed to just like, oh no, this is just a light trick, because our brains don't make, our brains aren't really, our brains, and more specifically our bodies, don't work in that kind of nuance. Like, our bodies don't make a discernment between real, perceived, or simulated action. It is just like the thing is happening.
Threat.
Yes, exactly. And this is why I'm being very mindful about how we navigate this play, because even though we're asking, and it's, I mean, I'm also got to think, I'm asking a bunch of 18 to 22-year-olds to do this. It's like, even though we're asking us to play and, you know, live truthfully under imaginary circumstances, the body doesn't make that discernment. And so like those fear, that cortisol, those stress hormones still course through your body, even though you're playing, because your body doesn't differentiate And so it is a matter of like, how do we make sure that we're creating this world, but in a sustainable way where we're not sending people home with that which can then become traumatic over, a prolonged period of time.
Yeah, without being able to diffuse that energy. Yeah, that makes sense. But I want to be respectful of your time. Would you be all right if we went to the last question? I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on this. I feel like theater in particular becomes a lightning rod for censorship. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on why theater as an art form tends to call down the ire of censors.
This is probably a very interesting way into the convo, but here we go. I have a friend, my friend Arnell is an amazing scenic designer. And I just worked on a show in which he designed this very beautiful, like Southern home, like on stage. And I was just like, "Ooh, you need to come." I was like, "You need to come and like, you need to come be my interior designer for like my apartment." And he goes, "An interior designer is meant to illuminate yourself to you. A scenic designer is meant to expose all of your secrets."
Ooh,
And I was like, one, don't come to my house. Don't.
You're
But
not invited.
yes, but two, theater in particular, or any kind of medium that is reflecting a society back to itself, is doing it whether or not the society is ready for that reflection or not. And so theater serves as a catalyst for change. But if we're talking about folks trying to maintain a status quo or try to keep things the way that they are, it then serves, it is seen as the enemy because it is essentially reflecting, it is uncovering, it is letting folks see. Because at the end of the day, what theater's ultimate call is, it's calling people to come and witness. And I think the things we get the most excited about when we're coming to theater is like seeing ourselves reflected up there on that stage. I know this is probably going to go to a little bit of a dark place, but hopefully we find our light at the end of it. But like, my brain goes to actually thinking about stuff. I think it's called the Poisonwood Bible. Like, I think
Yes.
I think of, that which, and I think the reason I'm thinking about Bible in particular is because of Crucible, but just like the fact that enslaved individuals were essentially told a story, an edited story of a text that many of people are just like, but this is truth, but are literally omitting truth from those individuals because you can't read Exodus, second book in the Bible. You can't read Exodus to people and be like, what are you talking about? Moses leading his people out of here and creating no. And so it is a matter of theater just does and does very honestly. It gives us a space in which we're watching a story where people cannot hide in. Truth is present. And so I would imagine places like books, specifically that which engages and opens up imagination and gives us the idea of what could be. Those things are not going to be welcome in a space that's trying to keep control, that is essentially trying to limit perspective. Because if you limit perspective or tell people that they're working from a space of limited resources, then you can create a dependency to then have to come to a source in order to get. But if, I think our society that we live in and all things capitalism would come crumbling down if we just simply went, hey, you have enough. You don't need to buy any more things. But I think the scariest thing to something like a capitalism is like telling people, like having content people that don't want things. Like I always joke, I'm just like, what's capitalism? It's like, capitalism is stealing you from yourself so it can sell you back to yourself.
Ooh, that's great.
So yeah, you're not enough. You're not pretty enough. But if you get this makeup, then you'll be pretty enough.
You'll
and
be
it's like,
the most amazing version of yourself.
Yes. As opposed to investing in the idea of what you have is enough, it is like, no, you're not enough. And here's the thing I can sell you and capitalize on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, it's used in, for connecting it back to Crucible, it's just like, it's used like you want to be seen as a good person. In Crucible, it comes in a form of coercion. And how I define coercion is using how somebody wants to be perceived against them. And so it's just like, you want to be seen as this good person, then you will confess and give us the name of your friends that are doing these things. And then it's followed by, because if they have nothing to hide, then, you know, what's the problem here? But it's not taking into account, is just like, you know, there's like coercion, there's manipulation, there's like torturing people in order to get confessions from them. There's like, there are very specific methods in which you extract this information, and that cannot be omitted from the conversation, but
Right.
so easily it is omitted from the conversation. So yeah, it is. I'm super excited to navigate and jump into this world. But I also know it is hard, because like I very clearly see the bridges between 1692 and 2023, which will be 2024, which will also be an election year. Like there is much to be talked about, and I am not surprised, specifically as an educator, that which is being gone after is that which is imagined worlds, things
Right.
that can be beyond what it is that we have now.
I really like that idea. Imagine worlds, a space where your mind can conceive of different realities than the ones that we have, or different systems or structures. That's to be feared.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your time and your thoughts today. This has been a wonderful conversation. Do you have time to just give some details about when people can expect to see the Crucible?
Yes, the Crucible. You can go on the Gainesville Theatre Alliance website to be able to get tickets. But Crucible runs from February 20th. Yeah, so we start rehearsals in January when we get back. It runs, excuse me, February 16th through February 24th. So after Valentine's Day. This may not necessarily be a date night kind of a show,
Yeah.
but it definitely elicit some conversations, I'll tell you that much. But yeah, but really excited to share this story with this community and be in continued dialogue with.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.